You'll turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 11, please. 1 Corinthians chapter 11. And we're going to be studying there tonight in our time together. 1 Corinthians, the 11th chapter. We've spent the last, 3 sermons or 4, I can't remember, talking about this book of 1 Corinthians and just going through it and hitting an overview and highlighting each of these sections as we've seen this letter that Paul writes. The first 4 chapters have to do with the division that was occurring amongst them as they were following after various men in the congregation there. They had preacheritis, and so Paul tells them how to deal with that issue, that it wasn't Paul that was crucified for you, it was Christ. And Christ is not divided. And so he talks about that in the first 4 chapters, encourages them to be of the same mind, the same judgment in the things that they have to do. That spirit of unity finds itself continuing on in the next chapter, even though chapter 5 has to deal with the idea of this, of how you deal with sin in the congregation, unrepentant sin. You have a man who's with his father's wife, and so they were arrogant and puffed up about it instead of dealing with the issue at hand. And he encourages them to deliver such a one to Satan and to not associate with him. I'm going to have to stop that if I can get through it tonight. But they needed to be unified in that. They needed to be together in their job as a church dealing with that issue. There were other issues that arose, and he talks about them in the next chapter, in chapter 6. And so he finally, when you get to chapter 7, he talks about in chapter 6 immorality and how that used to be something that they were a part of. But he says you've got to flee immorality. In chapter 7, he starts talking about marriage. He had received a letter from them, and they had questions. What if you do if you've been married and you're not married now? What if your spouse has died? What if you're never been married before? He answers those questions and deals with those marriage issues in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Chapters 8, 9, and 10 develop a unit, develop a section in and of itself. You might ask, as I did, as I was studying through it, why did they divide that into chapters then? Why not just make it one real long chapter? I mean, it's one section. And I never came up with an answer to that. Whoever came up with the chapters and verses and why they broke it here or there, they didn't write down their reasoning. But really, he does talk about 3 distinct things. They're all under the umbrella of liberties. Liberties that they had, but that they had to give a care about their brethren. And so chapter 8, as we talked about in Bible class this morning, it's this eating of meats. And so there wasn't anything inherently wrong with it. They had the liberty to do it. But if it made your weaker brother stumble, he said, I'll never eat meat again. He talks about the other liberties that he had that they could participate in chapters 9 and in chapter 10 as to whether or not he could partake of a wife, whether or not he could partake support, and all those sort of issues that he talks about in those 2 chapters. But that creates a section in and of itself of chapters 8, 9, and 10. And yet you get to chapter 11, which we haven't talked about yet, and instead of starting off on a new big section here, there's 2 different sections to chapter 11. And so it doesn't make a unit like 8, 9, and 10 does, but 2 different sections that he talks about. And I want to overview it with you for just a moment. The first about 16 verses, you have one topic being discussed, and then in the next verses 17 through 34, you have a completely different topic that's being discussed. And so I will tell you at the onset of talking about the first 16 verses that a lot of good brethren disagree about what he's discussing there. And you may disagree with me. I don't think that you're going to have a big disagreement with me about it, but it is entirely possible, and we'll still be brethren by the end of this talk tonight, whether we agree on this or not. In this section, in the first 16 verses, he's dealing with the covering, and you may have a title to that chapter about head coverings. And so there are good brethren that think one thing about this, and good brethren that think something else, and then there's some that they're still good brethren, but they're way out there in left field, in my opinion. And I won't tell you which one's which, and so you have to determine, okay? In verse 4, notice this. He says, every man has something on his head while praying or prophesying disgraces his head, but every woman who has her head uncovered while praying or prophesying disgraces her head. So it is talking about a covering, a head covering. And while good brethren may disagree about what that is, and commentaries will disagree, and all those sort of things, I think that there is a unifying principle that all of us, brethren that disagree on this topic and what it is, would agree on this. And that he's talking about something, but it's all relative to what he says in verse 3, and that is authority. And so he says, I want you to understand, verse 3, that Christ is the head of every man, the man is head of the woman, and God is head of Christ. And so he sets this idea of unity here, authority here in verse 3 with God, Christ, man, and woman. And this section has to do with that authority. Verse 10, he says, because of that, the woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. Now, whatever that means, and whatever you think it might mean, we can at least agree that it's in reference to, or its guiding principle is all relative back to the right to rule or the right to act. In this case, it's relative to the right to act. So what is it teaching to do? What's it talking about when it comes to head coverings? Well, you will find good brethren that say that it is improper for a woman to worship without a covering over her head. And this would be the text to go and to discuss that. And you would find others that would say, well, it's not that per se, although they would do that in Corinth. It was a custom that they would participate in there in Corinth, and so that's the issue at hand. And yet there's one other that I've heard, and good brethren have taught this, it's length of hair. And you may not have ever heard that as an argument, but some pretty good arguments are made that he's talking about a woman's hair is to be long and a man's hair is to be short. Well, I've got no problem with that. So I'm headed down the path of having no hair at all, so I don't have to worry about violating this. I don't know which one of the three it really is, to be honest. I favor the idea that he's talking about a custom that's being practiced there in the city of Corinth. And I'll tell you a little bit about that. But the main reason behind that is verse 16. He says, if one is inclined to be contentious, we have no other practice, nor have the churches of God. This is a good time to pause and to encourage you to know the tools that are in your Bible. Okay? And so one of the tools that you've got, if you've got the New American Standard, you'll see this a lot of times. King James has it and several others, but not all do. There's a footnote in verse 16, and you have the idea of what I'm reading in the New American Standard 95. It says, we have no other practice. Well, that kind of means something different than a literal translation. No other practice, evidently what they're saying is that it's kind of in addition. There's no other practice. I don't have anything to add to it. But the literal footnote off to the side changes that other and puts such there. So it's more specific. And so, in other words, if you want to argue about it, and what Paul is saying here in this, he says this is the pattern, and this is the practice of apostolic authority, and that may be the way that he is saying it, but the problem is in what he wrote is not other, but the idea of such. Such and other are opposed in meaning. So what he wrote was, we have no such practice. Here's what I think that he's talking about. In Corinth, in that time and in that situation, customs vary from city to city and time to time, and the covering was symbolic of authority at that time and in that city. Well, Paul, do you tell the same thing to the people over at Ephesus? By the way, Ephesus is where he's writing this letter from. Do you tell them the same thing? And here's his answer. He says, well, if somebody wants to argue about it and be contentious about it, then we have no such practice. In other words, that's a practice over there relative to the culture and the city and the time that's relative to authority, but we don't have that practice over here in Ephesus. Now, there are all sorts of customs throughout the Bible, and we don't participate in them specifically. I'll give you one good example. In John chapter 13, Jesus is washing the disciples' feet. And he tells them, if you understand what I'm doing, you do this. You go and do likewise. Okay? But yet, tonight, nobody, not a single one of y'all, offered to wash my stinky old feet. None of you said, take off your boots and socks, sit down, Coy, I got to wash your feet real fast. And reference John chapter 13. We would all say that's a custom of their time, and it's a custom of their society, and a custom of what they participate in. But the lesson was still applicable to us today, and the lesson was service. And he taught them to be good servants. Okay? That's one example. Here's another one. In Romans chapter 16 and in verse 16, he says, greet one another with a holy kiss. I'd like to express my appreciation to you tonight for not coming up and kissing me on the way in. That is not our culture today. but the principle still applies. The principle in what he's teaching there is to greet one another with a special love towards your brethren. And you've done well at that tonight, if I may say. And so we understand customs and things that they participated in, but we may not participate in the exact like manner because it is in and of itself a custom. I think that's the idea with the head covering here. And there's a lot more in this context. Remember, I'm just trying to overview the book, overview these sections and chapters. And so I'm not going to get necessarily into the nitty-gritty of it. But in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, I think he's talking about custom. Now, if you leave tonight and you say, I don't think he's talking about a custom, and I think that you should be wearing a head covering, women should and men shouldn't, then practice that. I'm not going to argue with you. And if you think that it means, and I know some really strong preachers, but that doesn't make it right or wrong, that means that women should have long hair and men should have short hair, I'm just looking around the room and I'm telling you, I know a lot of you don't think that. But if you do, go practice that. I'm not going to tell you and be able to convince you otherwise. And at the end of the day, I don't think it's a dividing matter between brethren. But read it and study it and come to your own conclusion on it. The next section I'm a little bit more confident about. Okay? So beginning in verse 17, going through the end of the chapter, has to do with something different. Verse 17, he says, in giving this instruction, I do not praise you because you come together not for the better, but for the worse. So the problem was, they came together in their assembly, and your purpose in coming together in the assembly is to better one another, encourage one another. This helps us understand what the purpose of the local church assembling together is. We come together for the better, but what they were doing when they came together was not accomplishing that. It wasn't accomplishing good for the brethren. Look at verse 20. He says, when you meet together, it's not to eat the Lord's Supper. That is what they should have been doing in meeting together. That doesn't mean it was the purpose entirely of their meeting together, but it is what they were participating in when they met together. And yet when they were coming together, they weren't doing that right. They weren't coming with the right attitude. I mentioned to you in class this morning that the American Standard, the old 1901, I think, American Standard, translates this and says, it's not possible to eat the Lord's Supper in verse 20. And I really am becoming more convinced that that's the correct translation. The reason is not because that inability to practice the Lord's Supper, partake of it, but what they're saying by translating it that way is you're in such a wrong state of mind, what you're doing is going through the motions, but it's not possible in your state of mind to partake of the Lord's Supper. The attitudes that are being addressed in this section are really what this section is about. And so to observe the memorial feast appropriately, you have to have the correct attitude. The correct attitude towards Christ and the correct attitude towards your brethren or the people who are observing it. Okay? Verse 22, he says, what? Do you not have houses in which to eat and drink? Or do you despise the church of God and shame those who have nothing? What shall I say to you? Shall I praise you? In this I will not praise you. So they came together, and in coming together, partaking of the Lord's Supper, it's different than it is for us tonight, this morning. This has been prepared for us. There's always somebody that volunteers to be sure we have that, have all the supplies together. But in their time, when you came together, you brought your provisions for the Lord's Supper. And there were those that were haves and those that were have-nots. There were rich and there were poor in the congregation there at Corinth. And so those that had plenty, those that were rich, brought plenty for themselves, and they filled their stomachs while they saw their brethren without. Their attitude was wrong towards their brethren. And so the issue at hand is I got to have the right attitude towards God, and I'm partaking this Lord's Supper, this memorial feast, and I got to have the right attitude towards my brother or sister. And so he says essentially, shame on you for having this wrong attitude. In verse 34, he says, one's hungry, let him eat at home, so that you will not come together for judgment. He says this, separate the social from the spiritual. Separate the entertainment from the spiritual. Your coming together is about worshiping together, encouraging one another, building one another up, and remembering the Lord's death. And so that internal division that was happening amongst these brethren, the haves and the have-nots, and the way they were acting about this in the Lord's Supper, he says that issue has to be resolved. It wasn't about the bread and the fruit of the vine to them. It was about, look at me and I'm all important and I have, and look at you, you're not important and you don't have. They're going to be in the right frame of mind if they get this principle under control. Look at verse 26. He says, as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until He comes. Is that it? If we don't do this, did the Lord not die? Is that all that is? No, that's not the idea. But what he's saying here in partaking of this in the right attitude, you're making a proclamation about the fact that the Lord died. It's a really important verse for us to keep in mind. This whole section, really, when we partake of the Lord's Supper, I know a lot of men like to read from it. It's a very appropriate verse to read before we partake of the Lord's Supper. There's some things in it very important to us to keep in mind. So I'm proclaiming the Lord's death, yet we're silent when we're partaking it. But that we're participating in tells something to the other person around the room and tells something to you as you partake of it. You're proclaiming the Lord's death. You're proclaiming your trust, your confidence, your eternity in the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus the Christ. You're making that proclamation. And not just that. Notice verse 28. He says, a man must examine himself, and in so doing, he's to eat the bread and drink the cup. When I examine myself through the lens of how God sees me, He sees the sinner that needed salvation. I will never be worthy of that sacrifice. I'm not going to be good enough for the sacrifice of Jesus. So when He talks about partaking in an unworthy manner, the unworthy manner isn't examining myself and saying, okay, I've got to a point now I'm worthy of it. No. The unworthy manner is not recognizing the right attitude towards the sacrifice, right attitude before God. That is, I submit myself in humility to Him. And He is the only one that can do anything about my sin. It's a good section for us, important section for us. We could spend all night talking about it and discussing it and roll it over into next Sunday too. But it gives us an overview about what that section is. Okay? Chapter 12 begins a new section. And because we like sections that are larger so much, it creates a multi-chapter section. From chapter 12, 13, and 14 all create one unit. And so those three chapters come together. And you might say, well, but chapter 13 is the love chapter. Well, it is the love chapter. But it's sandwiched just like an ice cream sandwich. It's got two pieces of cookie on each side talking about spiritual gifts. But there's the ice cream in the middle. You can go look at 1 Corinthians chapter 13 and learn about love, but you need to look at it in terms of the lens of each side of the context. And the context is how they participated in coming together with these spiritual gifts. There was a problem with their attitude. We just noticed the problem with the attitude in chapter 11. Here's the problem with their attitude here in spiritual gifts. Look at chapters 12 and verse 7. It says, each one's given the manifestation of the Spirit for the common good. What does the word common mean? It means belonging to all. So you could have the wrong attitude and say, I've got the spiritual gift. This came from the Holy Spirit. The apostles laid hands on me. The Holy Spirit gave me the gift to prophesy. I'm better than you. You've just got the spiritual gift to speak in tongues. And that's how they acted. And that's the wrong attitude. They exalt themselves. Their attitude becomes incorrect because this was not about you having the gift of tongues or interpreting or whatever it might be, but it is about the common good. In chapter 12, he uses the analogy of the body, and he says the hand's not for the hand. The hand in your body is for the good of the body. The eye's not for the eye. Where would the hearing be? The ear's not for the ear. It's for the good or the benefit of the whole body. And so that's the principle that he starts teaching. These spiritual gifts were for the benefit of all. They were for the common good. They were not for you to exalt yourself with the wrong attitude. And so that's the idea that you see in chapter 12. Skip over just a little bit to chapter 14. He makes application of the assembly where these gifts are exercised. Chapter 14 and verse 26, he says, what is the outcome then, brethren? When you assemble, each one has a psalm, has a teaching, has a revelation, has a tongue, has an interpretation. This is evidently the exercising of these spiritual gifts. And he tells the regulation of it right there at the end of it. Last sentence, let all things be done for edification. It's not just about, I've studied the Bible, and now I'm going to impart to you, you're blessed to be in my presence. No. It was about exercising these gifts that the Holy Spirit's empowered you with to edify each other. When you read these chapters, we got to recognize the overall theme through these 3 chapters is edification, edification, edification. That's looking outside of me, looking to my brethren, and supporting them for the common good. It's for the common good. I think there is some lessons to be learned here in this section. I don't have an extensive vocabulary, I'm sure you've noticed. But even if I did, if I got up here and I started speaking, and I was using $20 words, every other word, and you were going, whoo, right over mine, what'd he say? That wouldn't be for your edification then, would it? That would be the wrong attitude in doing that. So guess what? Our preaching needs to be done for edification, for the common good. Our teaching needs to be done for edification, for the common good. Our songs ought to have that principle. I think good question that Nikki asked tonight after our singing practice about the panoply of God. We sing that song, sang it this morning. Did we even know what that meant? Well, if we didn't, were we edified in it? It becomes important. We're not going through the motions. If we get up to say a prayer and we maybe lead the congregation in prayer, it's important for us men to speak up where everybody can hear. Why? For the common good, for edification. It's not just me and God praying, I'm leading people in prayer. So there's a lot of principles of that involved here that while we may not have spiritual gifts today, find themselves in application in what we practice and partake in our serving God as we assemble together. Now, that's chapter 12 and 14, and sandwiched in between that is chapter 13 on love. So look at the verse leading up to chapter 13. That would be 31. Chapter 12 and verse 31. It says, earnestly desire the greater gifts. So, he does not say you can't desire spiritual gifts. Matter of fact, it's the opposite. You can pray to ask for more. You can do all that sort of stuff as long as you're coming about with the right attitude. But he says, I'm actually going to show you something better than that. He says, I show you still a more excellent way. And then in chapter 13, he divides it into 3 sections. Okay? So if you go through and you mark this, then you'll see it. You'll see these 3 different sections in chapter 13. The first 3 verses have to do with if you don't have love, you have nothing. And so he starts to talk of it this way. He uses that phrase in these 3 verses. He says, if you do not have, do not have, do not have, the end result is you have nothing. You can do everything. You can practice all the spiritual gifts, but if you don't have love, it amounts to nothing. In verses 4 through 7, love is better because it affects how you think about and act towards one another. Guess what? Tongues won't do that. Prophecy won't do that, but love will. He starts to define what love is. Love's patient, love is kind, not jealous. He starts to show the superiority then of it in that section. And then in verses 8 through 13, all these gifts, these spiritual gifts he's talking about, that they were so proud that they had, are going to go away. And then what's going to last? Well, those are temporary, but love never fails. Look at verse 13. He says, now faith, hope, and love abide, these 3, but the greatest of these is love. If you take that verse out of context, the greatest of these is love, and sometimes that's done. The greatest thing in the Bible is love, then. If I take it out of context, that's what he's saying. Does that mean it's greater than faith? Well, here's a fact. You wouldn't love God without faith. Is it greater than hope? You won't persevere without hope. This isn't a statement here in verse 13 that's just made in a void somewhere. It's in the context of chapter 13 and how you treat one another. So love affects how you treat one another and your exercising of these spiritual gifts. And so that's why it is the greatest contextually. Don't take it out of its context. And so it's very valuable for us when we see a section in the Bible, see a book, see a chapter, whatever it might be. We find out what's the train of thought, who's being talked to, who is doing the talking, and what it is that they are talking about. It helps us to put this in the right frame of mind when we read through this section. Look at chapter 14 and in verse 37. Look how fast I'm going. Chapter 14 and verse 37. He says, if anyone thinks he's a prophet or spiritual, let him recognize the things that I write to you are the Lord's commandments. I want to stress this, that the idea of, in their society of gifts being so important, I'm not sure has really left. There are folks in our society, in the religious world today, that want to emphasize spiritual gifts, showing it as in the charismatic movement that this is some evidence of salvation or something of that thing. He says, in regulation of all of this, he says, if anyone thinks he is a prophet or spiritual, well, they did have prophets. They did have people with spiritual gifts at the time that he wrote it. And he says, let him recognize the things which I write are the Lord's commandments. He's saying this is regulating these things. This is the Lord's commandments that I'm saying. I'm an ambassador of the King. I'm an apostle. And I'm telling you these things are going to come to an end. He also says something else about spiritual gifts. If you ever watch a video of people that are so-called, quote-unquote, exercising spiritual gifts, you'll find a lot of craziness. I'm not trying to be rude. I'm just being honest. There's a lot of things going on. It seems like you can't control yourself. He says here you can control yourself. If you speak in tongues and there's no interpreter, he says to be quiet. He says sit down and be quiet. So you could regulate speaking in tongues at that time. You could not talk over one another if you had a prophecy. So you could control yourself. The way that, quote-unquote, gifts are exercised today, which they aren't, but the way that they may be shown today is different than what Paul is saying here. All things were to be done orderly, he says in chapter 14, and they're to be done for edification. And so you can control these things. The prophet controls his prophecy. And he says, back up in the chapter, he talks about in verse 34, for example, women to keep silent in churches. Well, what does that mean? Well, they're not to address the assembly like the prophet and the tongue speaker do. And that's a good lesson in and of itself. But he's saying that what he's directing is not just his opinion, but it's coming from the Lord. Look at verse 38. He says, if anyone does not recognize this, he's not recognized. I think some of your translations are probably going to put in verse 38, if anyone's ignorant, let them be ignorant. And that just seems kind of wrong almost to say it, doesn't it? But what he's saying is, if I understand the text, if a person in the church at Corinth says, I'm a prophet, I'm going to speak when I have the gift, no one's going to stop me, Paul says, don't recognize him. Don't listen to that guy. Don't recognize him as a prophet. He's ignorant. Comfortable in his ignorance, let him be ignorant then. What you're moved by, your foundation, this letter is signed by an ambassador of the King. This is the Lord's commandments. Okay? So that's the section there, chapters 12, 13, and 14. I encourage you to read it. It's really interesting the way Paul describes and talks about and regulates those things. Chapter 15 stands on its own as a section. And this section here, chapter 15, is the resurrection of the human body. And it seems so obvious, but yet there are those that would, even amongst churches of Christ today, that would say that the human body is not going to be raised. It's not talking about resurrection of the human body, and yet I find no other way that I can read through 1 Corinthians chapter 15 than talking about the human body being raised. And so what you're going to do then, as you recognize this and read through this as a casual reader you're going to see he starts talking about resurrection and the body. Look in verse 12. He says, Christ is preached, that he's been raised from the dead. How do some among you say there's no resurrection of the dead? What they preach about Christ was that Christ was raised from the dead. And so then, how could they say that there's no resurrection from the dead? It makes no sense. Now, I'm not saying that to say we can't understand the chapter. I'm saying that he's saying the logical fallacy has found itself in your reasoning, whichever brethren there at Corinth that were reasoning this way. You can't say there's no resurrection of the dead and then at the same time say, but Christ was raised from the dead. There's either resurrection or there's not resurrection. And so that's the phrase that he uses here, this question that he asks. Look down in verse 35. He says, someone will say, how are the dead raised, and with what kind of body do they come? So then people start asking, well, okay, then, smarty pants, If there's a resurrection, then how is that going to happen? I don't know. And with what kind of body do they come? Well, it's going to be a glorious body. But I don't know. Does that mean it's untrue? If I can't explain it, you can't explain it, does that mean that it's not right? Well, how did God make the axe float in the Old Testament? How did He flood the earth with water? How does He raise the dead? I don't know. But Paul says in verse 36, it's foolish to reason that way. You get lost in these questions. You want to know the nitty-gritty about it. You want to say, well, how is He going to do this? How is He going to do that? Those questions are foolishness. The fact that there is a resurrection from the body is the answer to the question in verse 12. In verse 20, he says, Christ has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who are asleep. So if there's first fruits, that means there are others like it. The body was raised, His body was raised, others will be raised. Look down in verse 51. He says, Behold, I tell you a mystery. We will not all sleep, but we will all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, the dead will be raised imperishable, and we will be changed. The dead what? The dead bodies. That's what it's about all throughout this chapter. Dead bodies will be raised. Verse 53, This perishable must put on imperishable, and the mortal must put on immorality. There's a day coming, thank the Lord, when this old body of pain and sickness and getting old and all that comes with that a Christian can look forward to, because we'll have a new body. What's it going to look like? I don't know. What I do know is it'll be immortal, powerful, glory. It's a fact, though. It's promised based upon the resurrection of Christ. So what? Verse 58. Therefore, that's a so what phrase, isn't it, when you say that word therefore? My beloved brethren, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that your toil is not in vain in the Lord. It's interesting to me that the same writer, Paul, writes the second letter, and in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, he talks about his own body. He talks about how his own body was beaten. He was left for dead. He had a thorn in the flesh, and all these other things that he experienced and had to look and had to deal with, this persecution. And he says, I'm looking forward to a time when I can enjoy dwelling in a new house, not made with hands. He's talking about a new body. That's why he could persevere throughout that difficulty. So chapter 15, as you read through it in your own time, you're going to find that to be a chapter that should be of great encouragement to us. Take the false teachings away. And the Corinthian church had some issues, and that's why he's writing that letter. There were some false teachings in regards to that. You know, what would you think? This is a side note, but what would you think if someone was sitting with us tonight? There may be, so I'm not trying to pick, but if someone was sitting with us and they said, I believe Jesus was risen from the dead, and I believe He's the Son of God, but I don't believe that the human body will be raised. What would you do? Would you say, I got to find somewhere else I'm going to go worship? I got to find some other church to be a part of, because there's that guy, maybe there's several of them, and they don't believe in the resurrection of the body. Paul didn't tell them to do that. Paul didn't tell them to cut loose and run away and go somewhere else. What he did was try to teach them. You're not going to have a group of people that's going to agree on everything. And in amongst us, however many are here tonight, if we took a poll on some things, maybe it was the coverings from chapter 11, maybe it's something else that is not even important. We're not going to agree on everything. But that doesn't mean that we can't work and worship together, and we can't be unified around the same purpose in serving Christ. Now, does that mean that we just accept every teaching and we never question and we never? No, it doesn't mean that at all. We stand upon truth and we stand firm for truth. But we also recognize that there's teaching that needs to be done. That we all are in a place of needing to learn. Nobody here, be sure I say it right, nobody here is an expert on it all. And nobody here knows it all and has got everything figured out. How young or how old you are does not matter. We're still learning. And we need to learn with the idea of I want to serve God and do what's right, and I want to stand by truth and truth alone. Not all of them were in a state of understanding on this topic here, or the topic of idols in chapter 8, but he didn't tell them to split. He told them to work and teach and try to get through some of that. Doesn't mean you don't take a stand for truth, but it's an interesting point to be made if it's right. Chapter 16. Like a lot of Paul's letters, is a concluding chapter. And so there's a number of topics in this last chapter. You're probably most familiar with the first 4 verses of chapter 16. And in the first 4 verses, he's talking about the collection. They already knew about the collection, and yet he's reminding them of it. And so what essentially he's telling them is that you need to have the money ready when I get there. And he's talked to the churches of Galatia about it as well. And so here's what he says in verse 2. On the first day of every week, each one of you is to put aside and save as he may prosper, so that no collections be made when I come. So he's on his way to Corinth. He says, when I get there, what I don't want you to do is to start trying to gather up in a rush, trying to gather this money. You've made a commitment, and so one of the ways you can fulfill that commitment is a regular weekly contribution on the first day of the week. That's what he told them to do. In verses 10 through 12, he talks about Timothy and Apollos. Look at verse 10. He says, if Timothy comes, see that he is with you without cause to be afraid, for he is doing the Lord's work as I also am. So let no one despise him, but send him on his way in peace, so that he may come to me, for I expect him with the brethren. And in verse 12, he talks about Apollos. Concerning Apollos, our brother, I encouraged him greatly to come to you with the brethren. So these 2 men he had great regard for and encouraged the church to treat them with respect. It's possible, I don't know for sure, but it's possible that he's saying that they could support Timothy in his work as an evangelist. Okay? In verse 13 through 14, kind of a summary admonition. And so I'll kind of use that as summary admonition for us here in studying this book. Just imagine you're part of this church at Corinth, and just think about all the issues that they were dealing with. In the first few chapters, it was following after this man, following after that one. You're all clustered about. But he says you need to be unified and serving and not be divided in your mind. There was immorality in their midst, and you got to battle that. In chapter 5 and in chapter 6, he talks about the conflict that the brethren would have with regards to that. In chapter 7, marriage. Or chapters 8 through 10, the eating of meats and the worshiping of idols and those sort of things. You think that's a battle. All these things are going to take work and effort, and they truly are probably going to be a battle, not in some physical fight sense, but there's difficulty that's before you. You ever been a part of a battle? You ever wish while you're in the part of a battle that things would just settle down and all could agree, and you don't have to go through that stuff and thrash about through all these issues and everybody get on the same page? Well, it doesn't always work that way. So here's the admonition, verse 13. Be on the alert. Stand firm in the faith. When there's danger, I think of these verses like a general encouraging his soldiers about to go into battle. And so when you see danger, he says, don't run, don't back down. You stand firm. When the battle engages, you stand firm in truth. You stand firm in the faith. In verse 13, he says, act like men. Stand like a man. You say, well, this doesn't apply to me. I'm not a man. No, what he's saying is stand firm. And sometimes, men, we need to be told to grow up and act like a man. And we have a responsibility before the Lord as to how we're supposed to serve and work in His kingdom. So act like a man. And so he tells them that. You can imagine a general telling his soldiers, don't you retreat. You get up there and you act like a man. And he says, be strong as the battle wages on. You get tired. He's saying, be strong and persevere in all this battle. Look at what he says in verse 14, though. He doesn't say you're harsh as men and you're standing strong to the worst of your brethren. He says, let all things that you do, or all that you do, be done in love. I tell you, verse 13 and 14 is a sermon in and of itself. A wonderful set of verses to admonish and encourage the church at Corinth that had so many problems. Maybe sometimes you've been in a place where you've experienced that. I hope not. So we're all so blessed to be at peace and to be working and worshiping here together. But I don't know what lies around the corner, and you don't know what lies around the corner. Here's the admonition that he makes to this group. You stand firm in the faith, acting like men. Be strong in all that you do. Let it be done in love. The various greetings in the end of the chapter there from the verses that follow, verses 15 all the way down through verse 24, relative to self and other brethren. But that's how he concludes, at least in my estimation, this book here, this letter to the Corinthian church that we call 1 Corinthians. Question, I guess, then is, what are they going to do with it? What do you do with it? Well, read it. Study it. And if you are curious about what happens when they read it and study it and put it into practice, then you're going to need to go read 2 Corinthians to find the follow-up to it, because that letter is based upon their reading and responding to the first letter. I'm not going to start going through in the same way 2 Corinthians, but I think it's good for us to do this from time to time. Just go through a book, look at what he's talking about, and gather the big picture and overview about that letter. Thank you for your good attention. I pray that study is an encouragement to you to go read the book. You can sit down and read it in less than an hour, or if you maybe take an hour and 15 minutes, depending on your speed of reading. It's a quick read, really, and it's an interesting read. But read it with the understanding of application to you and I and serving God here amongst our brethren as well. Thank you for your good attention. We've got a song that's selected that Ron's going to lead us in, and we'll use it as an opportunity if you need the help of the brethren here. We'd love to assist you in your serving of God. So let us know how we can help as we stand together and as we sing.